Miss Marple and the Candlelight Confession. Chapter 1. The Evening at Elmsworth. The village of Elmsworth rested quietly under a September moon, its cobbled lanes glistening faintly after a soft rain. Chimneys smoked gently, and the smell of damp earth mingled with coal fires. In the church hall, warm candlelight glowed against stone walls, where the ladies' circle held its weekly gathering. It was the sort of evening that belonged entirely to the ordinary. Knitted scarves spread across laps, teapots steaming, and polite chatter about gardens, hens, and the vicar's overlong sermons. Seated a little apart, her needles moving with steady rhythm, sat Miss Jane Marple. Her snowy hair framed her kind, wrinkled face, and though she looked absorbed in a half-finished sock, her pale eyes missed nothing. Not a twitch of the lips, not a hesitation in tone. The talk that night was lively enough until the church door opened with a groan, and Mr. Lionel Bexley, a retired solicitor with thinning hair and heavy jowls, entered. He rarely attended these gatherings, and at once, his appearance caused a stir. "Mr. Bexley!" cried Mrs. Harper. "Well, this is a surprise." He removed his hat, his face pale in the glow of candlelight. His hands trembled faintly as he held it. "Ladies, forgive my intrusion. But I feel I must unburden myself." The room hushed. Even the teacups seemed to pause midair. Mr. Bexley swallowed hard. "I have lived with a secret these many years. A grave mistake. And tonight, with God as my witness, I thought perhaps I might confess." A murmur rippled through the women. Secrets in Elmsworth were like rare coins, treasured, traded, never discarded. But before the man could continue, the vicar coughed meaningfully, glancing at the clock. Mrs. Harper fussed about the lateness of the hour. And with that, the moment slipped away. Mr. Bexley bowed his head, gave a faint, broken smile, and muttered, "Another time, then." He set his hat back on and shuffled out into the night, his footsteps echoing against the stones. For a moment, silence lingered. Then the chatter resumed, though in a softer, more speculative key. Miss Marple's needles clicked once more, but her eyes were distant, thoughtful. By dawn, the village was abuzz. For Lionel Bexley had been found dead in his study, slumped across his desk, the candlestick still burning low, and an expression of frozen terror fixed upon his face. Miss Marple, hearing the news at breakfast, laid down her teacup with the faintest sigh. "Ah," she murmured. So the confession was not only candlelit, but silenced altogether. Chapter 2. Whispers in the Morning. Morning light broke softly over Elmsworth, touching the thatched roofs with a pale gold glow. The village, usually so tranquil, buzzed with a different sort of energy. Word had spread quickly, too quickly as such things always did, that Lionel Bexley was dead. At the bakery, Mrs. Carter leaned over the counter, flour still dusting her hands. "Heart failure, they're saying. But I saw him not 3 days ago, walking sprightly enough. Mark my words, it's not natural." Across the lane, Mrs. Pritchard whispered to the postman, "Candles still burning, they say," and papers scattered all over his desk. Why would a man sit up half the night if not in terrible agitation? Theories multiplied with every passing hour. By the time the church bell tolled 10, Elmsworth was a cauldron of rumor. At the Green Man Inn, men gathered over pints to exchange opinions. One insisted that Bexley had enemies from his days as a solicitor. Another swore it must be suicide, the weight of some dreadful guilt. A third, lowering his voice, suggested murder. Meanwhile, at her cottage on the edge of the village, Miss Marple sat serenely at her breakfast table. Her knitting lay untouched, her teacup half full, for she was lost in thought. "Dead," she murmured softly, and only hours after declaring he wished to confess. Her housemaid, Mary, entered with a fresh pot of tea, her face flushed from gossip she had heard on the way. "They say the inspector's come from Barnstaple, ma'am. Inspector Graves, that's his name. Quite stern, they say. He's already at Mr. Bexley's house, asking questions." Miss Marple only nodded, though her blue eyes sharpened with interest. She knew of Inspector Graves, efficient, well-meaning, and inclined to believe the obvious. By mid-morning, the road to Bexley House was lined with curious villagers pretending to pass by. The house itself stood gloomy, ivy clinging to its stone walls, the curtains drawn in mourning. Inside, the atmosphere was thick with unease. Papers still littered the desk in the study. 2 long candles, guttered low, had left streaks of wax upon the oak. And there, in the heavy silence, stood Inspector Graves, a tall man with broad shoulders and a furrowed brow. He looked up sharply when Miss Marple appeared in the doorway, having been escorted in by the housekeeper. "Miss Marple," he said, with a mixture of courtesy and exasperation, "I might have known you'd turn up." "Quite by accident, Inspector," she said gently. "I was merely walking by, and Mrs. Finch insisted I come in. I shouldn't like to intrude." Graves gave a sigh. "Well, since you're here, you may as well look. Though I dare say this is nothing more than heart failure. Man was not young, not in the best of health. These things happen." Miss Marple's eyes moved over the scene with quiet attention. She noticed the spilled ink, the crumpled paper in the grate as though something had been burned in haste, and the curious placement of Mr. Bexley's spectacles, lying on the floor far from his chair. "Perhaps," she murmured. "And yet, it is a very curious sort of heart failure, don't you think?" Inspector Graves frowned, but Miss Marple only smiled her faint, unreadable smile and bent to examine a single wax drip that had fallen not upon the desk but onto the carpet, as though the candlestick had been moved. Outside, the whispers grew louder, circling the village like restless crows. For in Elmsworth, a man did not simply die without every neighbor, friend, and enemy speculating on the manner of it. And in the midst of it all, Miss Marple quietly gathered her first threads of truth. Sparkles, now the rumors are spreading. Inspector Graves enters, and Miss Marple begins noticing odd details. Glasses on the floor, burned papers, candle moved. Suspense is slowly building. Chapter 3. The First Suspicions. By the afternoon, Elmsworth had reached a fever of speculation. The grocer's shop was so full of whispering women that baskets of apples sat ignored on the counter. Every theory grew more dramatic than the last. Poisoning, blackmail, secret affairs. Miss Marple, walking quietly down the lane with her parasol, heard enough to form the beginning of her own impressions. Villages, she knew, rarely erred in their instincts, though gossip often muddied the details. Beneath exaggeration there was usually a grain of truth. At Bexley House, Inspector Graves continued his inquiries. The household was small. Mrs. Finch, the housekeeper, a nervous woman with reddened eyes. Thomas, the young footman, pale and jumpy. And Clara Bexley, Lionel's widowed niece, who had been staying with him for several weeks. Each was questioned, though answers were vague and unsatisfying. Mrs. Finch wrung her hands. "I heard nothing unusual, sir. I went up to bed at 10. Mr. Bexley often sat late with his papers, sometimes till dawn." Thomas shifted under the inspector's gaze. I brought him tea at 9:30. He seemed agitated, sir. Said he wanted no interruptions. That was the last I saw of him." Clara Bexley, however, stood cool and composed, her dark hair pinned neatly, her face pale but dry-eyed. "My uncle was a troubled man, Inspector. He lived with burdens you cannot imagine. I dare say his heart gave out. It was only a matter of time." Graves wrote brisk notes, but Miss Marple, seated unobtrusively in the corner, tilted her head. She did not miss the faint tremor in Clara's hand as she smoothed her skirt. When the formalities ended, Miss Marple drifted to the window, gazing out over the garden. "Such a handsome yew hedge," she said softly. "So very old. They do say yew trees keep secrets better than most people." Clara glanced sharply at her, then turned away. That evening, at the Green Man Inn, Inspector Graves allowed himself a pint while reviewing his notes. A local farmer leaned across with eager curiosity. "So it was his heart then, Inspector? Nothing more to it?" Graves shrugged. "Most likely. But the man did speak of wanting to make a confession, I'm told. Odd, isn't it? One wonders what weighed on him so." Miss Marple, who had come in quietly and seated herself with a pot of tea, spoke at last. Her voice was mild, but it silenced the room. "It is often the case," she said, "that when someone dies with a secret untold, another person breathes easier because of it." A hush fell. Men exchanged uneasy glances. Inspector Graves eyed her with suspicion. You think there's more to it, Miss Marple? She gave a gentle smile and returned to her knitting. Oh, I think very little, Inspector. I only observe. And one cannot help but notice in Elmsworth this morning, who whispered with relief, and who whispered with fear. Outside, the last of the daylight faded, and with it came the certainty that Lionel Bexley's death was not the end of the matter, but only the beginning. Sparkle's now suspicion has begun. We've met household members, Clara Bexley is acting strangely, and Miss Marple drops her first sharp observation in public. Chapter 4. Clues Among Ashes. The morning after Lionel Bexley's death, a light mist clung to the hedgerows of Elmsworth, turning the village into a watercolor of gray and green. Yet the stillness belied the restlessness beneath. The villagers were already dissecting every detail, every rumor, every theory. At Bexley House, Inspector Graves had ordered the study sealed until further examination. But it was Miss Marple who, with her deceptively mild manner, was allowed inside once more, ostensibly to keep Mrs. Finch company. The study smelled faintly of smoke. On the grate, the remains of half-burned papers curled in blackened fragments. Miss Marple, stooping slightly, lifted one with her knitting needle. Only part of a sentence remained legible. If the truth should come to light, the name of... The rest was charred away. Miss Marple slipped it back into the grate, her expression unreadable. She turned instead to the desk. On its surface lay Bexley's open journal, ink blotted and pages smudged, but nothing conclusive. Oddly, the last entry ended mid-sentence, as though the writer had been interrupted. Her eyes drifted lower to the carpet near the chair. There lay the spectacles, thick-rimmed, smeared, and cracked. Not neatly folded, as a careful man like Bexley would leave them, but cast aside. And beside them, a faint indentation in the rug. A heavy object had rested there briefly, now removed. A candlestick, perhaps. Strange, Miss Marple murmured. People who die of the heart rarely move their furniture about in the process. Mrs. Finch looked up, startled. Beg pardon, miss? Nothing, my dear. Only talking to myself. Later that day, at the vicarage, Miss Marple joined Reverend Chalmers and his wife for tea. Inevitably, talk turned to the tragedy. He was unsettled these last weeks, said Mrs. Chalmers. I heard from Clara that he spoke of the past catching up with him. Such curious words, don't you think? Miss Marple nodded. Very curious. The past has a way of doing so, especially when others would rather it remained buried. The vicar frowned. You don't mean foul play, Miss Marple? Her needles clicked softly. I mean only that people do not burn papers at midnight unless they wish something to remain unseen. That evening, as she walked home under the lanterns, Miss Marple's thoughts lingered on Clara Bexley. Composed, yes. Too composed. And her words that morning. It was only a matter of time. Such certainty, before even a doctor had given his opinion. Miss Marple paused at her garden gate, the mist curling around her ankles. Somewhere in Elmsworth, she knew, the truth lay hidden, in ashes, in whispers, in guilty eyes. And it was only a matter of time before it came to light. Sparkles, now we have early physical clues, burned paper, spectacles, candlestick mark, Clara's suspicious composure, and Miss Marple beginning to suspect cover-up. Chapter 5. The Wrong Man. The following morning brought a brisk wind across Elmsworth, scattering yellow leaves along the lanes. Yet even the autumn air could not cool the fever of speculation. By the time the church bell struck 9, a rumor was running through the village with the speed of fire. Inspector Graves had made an arrest. At the bakery, Mrs. Carter declared it was the footman Thomas. At the post office, Mrs. Pritchard swore it was a stranger seen loitering near the green. By midday, the truth emerged. Thomas the footman had been taken to Barnstaple for questioning. Of course it's him, Mrs. Harper insisted over her shopping basket. Young men like that, no family to speak of, always in trouble. And he was the last to see poor Mr. Bexley alive. Miss Marple, who happened to be examining a jar of marmalade nearby, only raised her brows. Yes, he was indeed the last to see him alive. But so, too, were the candles. The women stared, unsure what she meant. Miss Marple smiled pleasantly and went on her way. At Bexley House, Inspector Graves felt satisfied. He paced the study, papers in hand. "The lad admits Bexley was agitated that night," he told Sergeant Mills. "And Thomas is poor, badly paid. Motive enough if he thought he might gain something from it. A theft gone wrong, I shouldn't wonder." Miss Marple, who had been permitted a brief visit to deliver a basket of scones to Mrs. Finch, lingered politely at the doorway. "Forgive me, Inspector," she said gently, "but did Thomas have ink stains on his fingers when you arrested him?" Graves blinked. "What? Ink stains? No, I don't suppose so. Why?" "Oh, nothing," said Miss Marple, her needles clicking softly. "Only that Mr. Bexley's journal was interrupted mid-sentence. It suggests someone else dipped the pen, or prevented him from finishing." Graves frowned. "Always the details with you, Miss Marple. I've got my man, and I dare say the magistrate will agree. But in the village, the arrest unsettled more than it calmed. Thomas's mother, a washerwoman from Marleycombe, wept openly in the street, insisting her boy was innocent. Others shook their heads, recalling Lionel Bexley's professional life, the lawsuits, the broken clients, the enemies left behind. That evening, Miss Marple sat by her fire, her knitting untouched. She thought of Thomas's frightened eyes, the tremor in Clara Bexley's hand, and the curious burned scrap of paper. "No," she whispered to the empty room. "Thomas is not our murderer. The guilty party is far nearer home, and far more clever." Outside, the wind rattled the shutters of the cottage, as though agreeing with her. Sparkles in this chapter. Thomas, the footman, is arrested as the convenient suspect, but Miss Marple already sees through it. Clues are pointing inward, toward the Bexley household. Would you like me to go straight into Chapter 6, where hidden rivalries and old grudges begin to surface? Or pause here and draft a mini outline of Chapters 6 to 10 so you can preview the suspense arc? You said. 6. ChatGPT said. Excellent. Okay, hand time to dive into Chapter 6, where whispers of old grudges and rivalries start surfacing, and Miss Marple quietly collects the threads others dismiss. Chapter 6. Shadows of the Past. The church bells tolled on Sunday morning, summoning the faithful to St. Mildred's of Elmsworth. The pews filled with rustling skirts, polished boots, and the faint scent of mothballs and lavender polish. Yet beneath the hymns and prayers lay a current of unease. Everyone's eyes, it seemed, flickered toward the Bexley pew, now occupied only by Clara Bexley, pale and stiff, her black veil trembling ever so slightly with each breath. Miss Marple sat 2 rows behind, knitting needles tucked into her bag, observing quietly. She noticed the way Clara avoided glancing at the vicar's wife. She saw, too, how Mr. Charles Denning, the village solicitor, gave Clara a curt nod rather than his usual warm bow. After the service, gossip spilled into the churchyard like water from a cracked jug. "Lionel and Denning had words last month," whispered Mrs. Carter. "Over a boundary hedge or so I heard." "Boundary hedge? Nonsense," sniffed Mrs. Harper. "It was about that investment scheme. Denning lost a tidy sum." Miss Marple lingered near the lich-gate, pretending to fuss with her gloves. She caught another tidbit, from 2 younger women, voices low but eager. "They say Lionel once courted Clara's sister years ago. It ended badly. Perhaps she never forgave him." By midweek, the vicar's wife, Mrs. Chataway, invited Miss Marple for tea, under the guise of sharing a new sponge recipe. The real menu, of course, was rumor. "It's all too dreadful, Jane," Mrs. Chataway confided, lowering her voice. "But you must have noticed. Lionel had a temper. I once saw him shout at poor Thomas as though he were a dog. And yet, there's more. Something between Lionel and Mrs. Finch, his housekeeper. One doesn't like to speak of such things, but—" Her words trailed off meaningfully, leaving the rest to imagination. Miss Marple stirred her tea gently, her blue eyes thoughtful. "It is remarkable," she murmured, "how often resentments and, shall we say, attachments linger beneath the surface. In my experience, they are rather like weeds in a garden. One never notices until they have entirely taken root." That evening, back at her cottage, Miss Marple laid her notes on the small writing desk. Threads were beginning to appear. Denning's financial grievance, Clara's uneasy history, a strained relationship with Mrs. Finch, A household staff too frightened to speak freely. She picked up her knitting and reflected. The police are busy with Thomas, poor boy. But it is within the walls of Bexley House where the truth lies buried. And sooner or later it will come to light. As the candle burned low, Miss Marple whispered softly to herself, "Every confession is born in candlelight, whether given freely or torn from the guilty." Sparkles in this chapter. The village rivalries, old grudges, and possible affairs begin surfacing, showing that Lionel Bexley had more than one enemy. Miss Marple is weaving them into her quiet map of human motives. Chapter 6. Shadows of the Past. The church bells tolled on Sunday morning, summoning the faithful to St. Mildred's of Elmsworth. The pews filled with rustling skirts, polished boots, and the faint scent of mothballs and lavender polish. Yet beneath the hymns and prayers lay a current of unease. Everyone's eyes, it seemed, flickered toward the Bexley pew, now occupied only by Clara Bexley, pale and stiff, her black veil trembling ever so slightly with each breath. Miss Marple sat 2 rows behind, knitting needles tucked into her bag, observing quietly. She noticed the way Clara avoided glancing at the vicar's wife. She saw, too, how Mr. Charles Denning, the village solicitor, gave Clara a curt nod rather than his usual warm bow. After the service, gossip spilled into the churchyard like water from a cracked jug. "Lionel and Denning had words last month," whispered Mrs. Carter. "Over a boundary hedge or so I heard." "Boundary hedge? Nonsense," sniffed Mrs. Harper. "It was about that investment scheme. Denning lost a tidy sum." Miss Marple lingered near the lich-gate, pretending to fuss with her gloves. She caught another tidbit, from 2 younger women, voices low but eager. "They say Lionel once courted Clara's sister years ago. It ended badly. Perhaps she never forgave him." By midweek, the vicar's wife, Mrs. Chataway, invited Miss Marple for tea, under the guise of sharing a new sponge recipe. The real menu, of course, was rumor. "It's all too dreadful, Jane," Mrs. Chataway confided, lowering her voice. "But you must have noticed. Lionel had a temper. I once saw him shout at poor Thomas as though he were a dog. And yet, there's more. Something between Lionel and Mrs. Finch, his housekeeper. One doesn't like to speak of such things, but—" Her words trailed off meaningfully, leaving the rest to imagination. Miss Marple stirred her tea gently, her blue eyes thoughtful. "It is remarkable," she murmured, "how often resentments and, shall we say, attachments linger beneath the surface. In my experience, they are rather like weeds in a garden. One never notices until they have entirely taken root." That evening, back at her cottage, Miss Marple laid her notes on the small writing desk. Threads were beginning to appear. Denning's financial grievance. Clara's uneasy history. A strained relationship with Mrs. Finch. A household staff too frightened to speak freely. She picked up her knitting and reflected. The police are busy with Thomas, poor boy. But it is within the walls of Bexley House where the truth lies buried. And sooner or later it will come to light. As the candle burned low, Miss Marple whispered softly to herself, "Every confession is born in candlelight, whether given freely or torn from the guilty." Sparkles in this chapter. The village rivalries, old grudges, and possible affairs begin surfacing, showing that Lionel Bexley had more than one enemy. Miss Marple is weaving them into her quiet map of human motives. Chapter 7. A Letter in the Ashes. The rain came down in thin, relentless sheets, blurring the cobbled streets of Elmsworth into dull silver streaks. Villagers hurried beneath umbrellas, yet still found time to lean close and whisper, "Thomas has confessed. Thomas will hang. Thomas is innocent," depending on whose version of the story reached them first. But that evening at Bexley House, an unsettling discovery unsettled even the inspector's tidy narrative. Mrs. Finch, the housekeeper, had been clearing the hearth in Lionel Bexley's study. The grate was choked with damp ash, the kind that clung stubbornly to the brush. But lodged between the blackened lumps of coal, she found something half-burnt, a fragment of parchment. She carried it, trembling, to Clara Bexley. Clara, in turn, summoned Inspector Graves. And thus the charred scrap ended up spread across the desk under a lamp's yellow glow. It bore only a few words, ink blurred but legible. "If you tell them, I will ruin you. Better to remain silent. Meet me at. The line ended in a jagged tear, the rest consumed by flame. Good God, muttered Graves. A threat. Blackmail, no doubt. He jabbed at the paper with his finger. And proof positive that Thomas was mixed up in something vile with Bexley. Miss Marple, who had been invited to observe on the pretense of her sharp old eyes, leaned closer. It is curious, she said mildly, how carefully this was burned, as though the hand that consigned it to the fire wished for it to be utterly destroyed, and yet not too quickly. Graves grunted. Meaning, Miss Marple said, eyes flicking toward Clara, that whoever placed it there lingered. And people rarely linger at a fire when they are frightened. They linger when they are angry. Clara gave a soft gasp, her hand trembling against the edge of the desk. Graves shot her a sharp glance, but she quickly turned away. That night, as Miss Marple walked home beneath her umbrella, she pondered the fragment. A blackmail letter. A fire. A threat of ruin. But most telling of all, the words were written in a neat, slanting hand. Not the hand of a servant. Not the scrawl of Thomas. Ah, she whispered to the rain. Secrets written in ink always betray their masters. And this one belongs to someone far closer to the Bexleys than the inspector cares to admit. Lightning flashed above the thatched rooftops, illuminating the village green in stark white. For a moment, it seemed to Miss Marple that the whole village stood under judgment, and the candlelight of confession was drawing nearer. Sparkles in this chapter, a burnt blackmail letter is found in the study, proving that someone wanted Lionel Bexley silenced. It deepens suspicion but also shows Thomas could not have written it. Miss Marple spots the subtle truth. This was the work of someone within the Bexley circle. Chapter 8. A second shock. The air in Elmsworth was heavy the next morning, the rain having left the hedgerows slick and glistening. Yet the dampness did nothing to still the villagers' tongues. The blackmail letter had already slipped into rumor, though no one could agree on the details. Some swore Lionel Bexley had been ruined in business, others whispered of scandalous affairs. By mid-afternoon, however, gossip gave way to alarm. Another body had been found. It was Mrs. Finch, the housekeeper. She had been discovered in her small bedroom at Bexley House, slumped across the bed, the candle on her nightstand burned down to a pool of wax. Her lips were tinged with a faint bluish hue, and beside her stood an empty glass. Inspector Graves wasted no time. Poison, he announced grimly, examining the scene. She must have taken it herself. Guilt, no doubt, after conspiring with Thomas. Miss Marple, who had been quietly summoned by a tearful Clara, bent to examine the waxy puddle on the nightstand. The candle had burned for hours, leaving a curious pattern, as if something had been pressed against it and then removed. She looked, too, at the glass. Not a hint of residue clung to its sides. Someone had been very careful. Too careful. No, Inspector, she said softly, straightening. This was no suicide. Mrs. Finch had lived too long in shadows to choose such an exit. Someone feared she might speak, and silenced her first. The inspector scowled. You can't know that. But Miss Marple's eyes moved to Clara, who stood trembling in the doorway. For the briefest moment, Clara's gaze dropped, not toward Mrs. Finch, but toward the locked drawer of Lionel's desk, visible through the open study door. It was a flicker, a fragment of human weakness. Yet to Miss Marple it spoke volumes. That evening, the village was alive with dread. First Lionel Bexley, now Mrs. Finch. 2 deaths in a matter of days. And still the truth lay hidden. At her cottage, Miss Marple set aside her knitting untouched. Her thoughts turned to the charred letter, the locked desk drawer, Clara's trembling hand. 2 deaths rarely come by chance, she murmured. No, when one candle is snuffed, another soon follows. Someone is extinguishing the truth, wick by wick. Outside, the night pressed in, thick and silent. And somewhere in Elmsworth, the murderer walked free. More desperate, more dangerous than before. Sparkles in this chapter, the second shock, Mrs. Finch is murdered, staged as suicide by poison. Miss Marple knows this is no accident. Someone is eliminating witnesses. The circle of suspects tightens around the Bexley household. Chapter 9. Clara's Secret. Elmsworth awoke under a shroud of fear. The second death had unsettled even the most hardened gossips, silencing chatter in the grocer's queue and leaving the pews at St. Mildred's half empty. The vicar prayed with unusual fervor, as though his words might hold back the darkness creeping into the village. Miss Marple, however, saw what others missed. Clara Bexley had grown quieter, paler, and strangely distant. She went about the arrangements for Mrs. Finch's burial with a polite efficiency, yet her hands trembled when they touched the black-edged stationery. On the third evening after Mrs. Finch's death, Miss Marple accepted Clara's invitation for tea at Bexley House. The drawing-room smelled faintly of roses, though the flowers in the vases had wilted. Clara poured the tea with delicate precision, her eyes downcast. "I do not know how much more of this I can bear," she said at last. Her voice was low, heavy with exhaustion. "First Lionel, then poor Mrs. Finch. It is as though the house itself is cursed." Miss Marple stirred her cup gently. "Curses are rarely the cause, my dear. More often it is human nature. Ambition, resentment, fear. They do dreadful things in quiet corners." Clara's hands froze on the porcelain. A faint flush crept across her cheeks. There was a silence, broken only by the tick of the clock. Then Clara set the teapot down a little too firmly. "Lionel was not the man people thought him to be," she whispered. "He had dealings. Affairs of money, yes, but also of the heart. Mrs. Finch knew too much. That is why she—" She broke off, pressing a hand to her mouth. Miss Marple leaned forward, her eyes kind but steady. "And you, my dear, did you know too much as well?" For a long moment, Clara looked at her with wide, frightened eyes. Then she rose abruptly, moving to the desk by the window. She unlocked a drawer and withdrew a small packet, tied with faded ribbon. "These letters," she said, holding them tightly, "are not mine. They were written by Lionel, but not to me. To another woman. Years ago. She was my own sister." Miss Marple accepted the packet gently, her mind quickening. The faded ink spoke of passion, betrayal, promises never kept. One line, repeated in different letters, stood out. "If you tell them, I will ruin you." It was the same phrasing as the charred fragment from the grate. Clara sank into the chair, her face pale as parchment. She left him, of course. Married elsewhere. But he never forgave her. He swore she would regret it. And when she died, he turned his bitterness upon me. Upon us all. Miss Marple laid a gentle hand on Clara's arm. "Secrets, my dear, have a way of breeding tragedy when left in the dark. And I fear this secret has not yet finished its work." Outside, the evening wind rattled the shutters. Inside, Clara's confession cast a long shadow, one that stretched far beyond the walls of Bexley House, reaching into every corner of the village where Lionel Bexley had left his mark. Miss Marple's eyes glinted. The puzzle was tightening piece by piece, and somewhere the murderer was growing desperate. Sparkles in this chapter. Clara finally admits a family secret. Lionel once courted her sister, and the blackmail threats came from that broken past. The letters prove the handwriting doesn't belong to Thomas. The mystery deepens. Chapter 10. The Village Gathering. The vicarage drawing-room was warm with lamplight, a comfort against the damp chill that clung to Elmsworth. Mrs. Chataway, ever eager to restore a sense of normalcy, had insisted on hosting a small gathering. Tea, seed cake, and polite conversation. It was, she said, exactly what the village needs to lift its spirits. But beneath the cheerful chatter and clink of teacups, unease lingered. Clara Bexley sat rigid near the fire, her face pale, her black dress stark against the red armchair. Mr. Denning, the solicitor, was present as well, his manner courteous yet clipped. Several villagers had come too, Mrs. Carter, Mrs. Harper, and even young Thomas's mother, who sat stiffly, refusing cake. Miss Marple, knitting in her lap, surveyed them all with her serene blue eyes. She had encouraged the gathering, knowing that people reveal more in company than in solitude. Gossip loosens tongues, and guilt makes them tremble. At one point, Mrs. Harper, who never could resist stirring the pot, said loudly, "Well, we all know poor Thomas is as good as convicted. The police wouldn't keep him if they weren't certain." A murmur ran through the room. All eyes flicked, consciously or not, toward Clara. Her hands tightened on her teacup. Miss Marple spoke softly, almost as if to herself. Curious, isn't it, how quickly we believe the simplest answer? And yet, in my garden, it is never the weed one expects that chokes the roses. It is the hidden root, deep below the soil. There was silence. Then Mr. Denning gave a sharp laugh. With respect, Miss Marple, this is hardly gardening. It's murder. A straightforward case. On the contrary, Miss Marple replied, her needles clicking. Murder is never straightforward. It requires motive and fear. One kills because one is cornered. At that moment, a clumsy movement drew everyone's attention. Clara had set down her cup, but the saucer rattled violently against the table. Her eyes were wide, fixed not on Miss Marple but on Mr. Denning. The solicitor's jaw tightened. For a brief instant, his hand strayed to his pocket, as though protecting something hidden within. Miss Marple noticed. She also noticed Clara's trembling fingers, the vicar's nervous cough, and the way Mrs. Chataway rushed to refill the cups as though to smooth over the tension. The evening ended without incident, yet the air was thick with unspoken words. Guests departed into the damp night, their lanterns bobbing along the lanes. Later, in her cottage, Miss Marple laid aside her knitting and reflected. She had seen enough: Clara's fear, Denning's guarded gesture, the village's hunger for an easy culprit. Yes, she murmured. The time is near. The truth will surface, and the guilty will betray themselves, just as surely as a candle guttering before it dies. Outside, the wind pressed against the windows, as though urging her onward. Sparkles in this chapter. Miss Marple subtly stages a gathering to watch the villagers' reactions. Clara nearly cracks, and Denning shows suspicious behavior. The trap isn't sprung yet, but threads are tightening. Chapter 11. The Solicitor's Ledger. 2 days after the gathering at the vicarage, Miss Marple paid a quiet visit to the solicitor's office on the High Street. Mr. Denning's brass plate gleamed respectably, but the rooms within told another story. The carpet was worn, the fire burned low, and the scent of stale ink and dust hung in the air. Mr. Denning himself sat behind a desk littered with papers. He looked up sharply when Miss Marple entered. "Miss Marple," he said, his voice clipped. "I'm rather busy, as you see." "I won't trouble you long," she replied pleasantly, settling into the chair opposite. "I only wondered if you might recall a small matter. Lionel Bexley's investments. Such things are so dull, but I do so enjoy understanding how people manage their affairs. One learns so much about character, don't you think?" Denning's face tightened. "Mr. Bexley's finances are no concern of yours." "Ah, but they were of yours, were they not?" Miss Marple's eyes rested kindly on his, though her tone carried a note of quiet certainty. "I hear there was some unpleasantness. A hedge, an investment. Perhaps both." Denning bristled. "If villagers have been wagging their tongues, that is hardly evidence." Miss Marple folded her hands. "Evidence takes many forms, Mr. Denning. A missing check. A letter in the fire. A ledger. Perhaps kept a little too carefully." His gaze flickered just for a second toward a locked drawer in his desk. Miss Marple saw it. She always saw. That afternoon, with Denning still bristling in her memory, she called on the postmistress, Mrs. Pritchard, who rarely failed to notice anything that passed through her hands. "Oh yes," Mrs. Pritchard said readily. "There were several registered envelopes between Mr. Denning and Mr. Bexley over the summer. Thick ones, too. Arguments about money, I shouldn't wonder. And didn't Bexley threaten to expose Denning at the magistrate's court? That was the talk of the back room." Miss Marple thanked her and walked home, her thoughts knitting together faster than her needles ever could. By evening she had laid out her notes. Denning ruined by an investment. Threatened exposure by Bexley. A hidden ledger, most likely containing proof. It was motive enough. And yet something still jarred. For all his pride, Denning did not strike her as a man willing to kill twice over. He was clever, yes, but not desperate in the way Mrs. Finch's murder suggested. Still, Denning's secrets were dangerous. They tied him to Bexley's ruin, and perhaps, just perhaps, to his death. At her cottage window, Miss Marple watched the lamps of Elmsworth flicker one by one into darkness. Somewhere in the village, the killer thought himself safe. But secrets, she knew, had a way of slipping out, like candlelight seeping through a crack in the shutter. And she was watching for the flicker. Sparkles in this chapter. Miss Marple learns about Denning's financial ruin and secret correspondence with Lionel. His hidden ledger is a key clue, but she senses the murders may require more than his wounded pride. Backhand index pointing right. Do you want me to go straight into Chapter 12, where Miss Marple discovers a startling clue in Mrs. Finch's belongings? Or would you prefer a summary outline of Chapters 12 to 15 before I dive in? You said. Yes. ChatGPT said. Great, thumbs up. You want me to continue straight. So let's move into Chapter 12, where Miss Marple uncovers something crucial in Mrs. Finch's belongings. Chapter 12. The Housekeeper's Key. The village of Elmsworth wore an uneasy hush. Curtains twitched less openly now, gossip spoken in whispers rather than shouts. 2 deaths in as many weeks had given even the most hardened busybodies pause. Miss Marple, however, remained undeterred. On a crisp Thursday morning, she paid a visit to Clara Bexley under the pretext of delivering a jar of quince jelly. Clara, pale and distracted, received her with faint gratitude and allowed her into the house. It was while Clara excused herself to take a message that Miss Marple's eyes wandered. She did not snoop, never that, but she noticed what others might miss. A small wooden box, sitting half-forgotten on a side table near the stairs. Upon its lid was a brass plate, engraved simply, F. When Clara returned, Miss Marple asked lightly, "I couldn't help noticing, is that Mrs. Finch's?" Clara hesitated. Yes. Her things. The police had no interest. I have not yet had the heart to open it. With a gentle hand, Miss Marple touched the box. Perhaps it might be wise, she said softly. Sometimes the smallest belongings speak loudest. Clara allowed her to lift the lid. Inside were neatly folded linens, a prayer book, and a few personal trinkets. But at the very bottom lay a small iron key, tied with string, and a folded slip of paper. Miss Marple's fingers trembled ever so slightly as she unfolded it. The handwriting was spidery but clear. Keep this safe. Should anything happen, the drawer will tell the truth. The drawer. Miss Marple's mind leapt at once to Lionel Bexley's study. The locked drawer that Clara had glanced at. The one Denning had eyed with such unease. Clara's face drained of color. I did not know she had this. Mrs. Finch never spoke of it. Miss Marple replaced the items carefully, her manner calm. Housekeepers, my dear, often see far more than their masters realize. Loyalty keeps them silent, until fear compels otherwise. Later that evening, alone in her cottage, Miss Marple set the kettle to boil and studied her notes. Mrs. Finch had kept a key. She had hinted at a truth hidden in Lionel's drawer. That meant she had not only known Lionel's secrets, she had guarded proof of them. And proof, Miss Marple thought grimly, is often the most dangerous possession of all. As she sipped her tea, she glanced at the candle flickering on her table. The flame leaned and wavered, as though mirroring the fragile line between truth and concealment. Someone, she whispered, is killing to keep that drawer unopened. And soon I must see for myself what lies within. Sparkles in this chapter. Miss Marple discovers Mrs. Finch left behind a key and a cryptic note, pointing to Lionel Bexley's locked study drawer. This raises the stakes. What truth lies hidden there? Chapter 12. The Housekeeper's Key. The village of Elmsworth wore an uneasy hush. Curtains twitched less openly now, gossip spoken in whispers rather than shouts. 2 deaths in as many weeks had given even the most hardened busybodies pause. Miss Marple, however, remained undeterred. On a crisp Thursday morning, she paid a visit to Clara Bexley under the pretext of delivering a jar of quince jelly. Clara, pale and distracted, received her with faint gratitude and allowed her into the house. It was while Clara excused herself to take a message that Miss Marple's eyes wandered. She did not snoop, never that, but she noticed what others might miss. A small wooden box, sitting half-forgotten on a side table near the stairs. Upon its lid was a brass plate, engraved simply, F. When Clara returned, Miss Marple asked lightly, I couldn't help noticing, is that Mrs. Finch's? Clara hesitated. Yes. Her things. The police had no interest. I have not yet had the heart to open it. With a gentle hand, Miss Marple touched the box. Perhaps it might be wise, she said softly. Sometimes the smallest belongings speak loudest. Clara allowed her to lift the lid. Inside were neatly folded linens, a prayer book, and a few personal trinkets. But at the very bottom lay a small iron key, tied with string, and a folded slip of paper. Miss Marple's fingers trembled ever so slightly as she unfolded it. The handwriting was spidery but clear. Keep this safe. Should anything happen, the drawer will tell the truth. The drawer. Miss Marple's mind leapt at once to Lionel Bexley's study. The locked drawer that Clara had glanced at. The one Denning had eyed with such unease. Clara's face drained of color. I did not know she had this. Mrs. Finch never spoke of it. Miss Marple replaced the items carefully, her manner calm. Housekeepers, my dear, often see far more than their masters realize. Loyalty keeps them silent, until fear compels otherwise. Later that evening, alone in her cottage, Miss Marple set the kettle to boil and studied her notes. Mrs. Finch had kept a key. She had hinted at a truth hidden in Lionel's drawer. That meant she had not only known Lionel's secrets, she had guarded proof of them. And proof, Miss Marple thought grimly, is often the most dangerous possession of all. As she sipped her tea, she glanced at the candle flickering on her table. The flame leaned and wavered, as though mirroring the fragile line between truth and concealment. Someone, she whispered, is killing to keep that drawer unopened. And soon I must see for myself what lies within. Sparkles in this chapter. Miss Marple discovers Mrs. Finch left behind a key and a cryptic note, pointing to Lionel Bexley's locked study drawer. This raises the stakes. What truth lies hidden there? Chapter 13. The Locked Drawer. The next afternoon, Elmsworth was drenched in drizzle. The streets gleamed with rain, and the few villagers abroad hurried along, collars turned up against the damp. Miss Marple, however, walked with her usual deliberate step, umbrella neatly tilted, eyes sharp beneath the brim of her hat. She had chosen her time carefully. Clara Bexley had been persuaded to take luncheon with a friend at the vicarage, leaving the house quiet. With Denning's grudging permission, for he saw no harm in indulging the old lady's curiosity, Miss Marple was allowed into Lionel Bexley's study. The room smelled faintly of pipe smoke and leather. Heavy curtains dimmed the light, and the great oak desk dominated the space. Its drawers were locked, all save the topmost, which contained nothing but pens and blotting paper. Miss Marple sat primly in the high-backed chair and withdrew the little iron key from her reticule. Her hands were steady as she bent over the central drawer. The lock resisted at first, but with a faint click it yielded. Inside, beneath neat stacks of correspondence, lay a bundle of letters bound with red ribbon. On top of them rested a smaller envelope, addressed in a bold hand. For Clara. To be opened only if necessity compels. Miss Marple hesitated, then set the envelope aside. The letters beneath were older, their paper yellowed. She unfolded one, and her lips tightened. They were not business letters. They were confessions. Lionel Bexley had been conducting an affair, not with a lady of standing, but with Mrs. Finch, his housekeeper. The letters were desperate, passionate, full of promises he had no intention of keeping. And at the bottom of the drawer, wrapped in oilskin, was something even more damning, a ledger. It contained payments made quietly over years. Hush money, Miss Marple thought grimly, to silence debts, indiscretions, and worse. As she turned a page, a blot of ink caught her eye. No, not ink. A rusty stain, seeping through the paper. Blood. She closed the ledger quickly, heart thumping. Someone had handled it on the night of Lionel's death. Someone whose hands were not clean. The door creaked suddenly, and Miss Marple glanced up. Detective Inspector Denning stood in the doorway, watching her with narrowed eyes. "You seem," he said slowly, "to have made yourself very much at home." Miss Marple smiled faintly, smoothing her skirt. "Not at all, Inspector. I have merely opened a drawer. But it appears, does it not, that this drawer contains the true history of Mr. Bexley's affairs?" Denning stepped closer. his expression unreadable. "Affairs can be dangerous things, Miss Marple. Dangerous and deadly." Sparkles in this chapter. Miss Marple unlocks Lionel Bexley's drawer and uncovers love letters between Lionel and Mrs. Finch, plus a ledger of hush payments, stained with blood. The stakes rise as Denning catches her in the act. Chapter 14. Whispers in the Rain. The drizzle lingered all through the next day, cloaking Elmsworth in a gray, secretive mood. People moved about briskly, yet every encounter in the high street seemed to end the same way, with a hushed exchange, a quick glance over the shoulder, and a hurried departure. Gossip was alive, stronger than ever. It began with Mrs. Finch. Word had spread, though none could say how, that Lionel Bexley's housekeeper had been more than a servant to him. The letters Miss Marple had discovered were now in Denning's possession, but somehow their existence was already suspected. At the grocer's, Mrs. Alder leaned across the counter, whispering to her neighbor, "Imagine, all those years right under poor Clara's nose." At the post office, Mr. Harcourt muttered darkly, "Hush money. That's what it'll be. I'll wager Lionel paid to keep her quiet." And at the vicarage tea, Mrs. Wainwright fanned herself with a lace handkerchief and declared, "It explains everything. A woman scorned can be very dangerous." Meanwhile, Clara Bexley walked the streets like a ghost. Her face was pale, her lips pressed tight, and when well-meaning ladies approached her, she brushed past without a word. The shame of it all, Lionel's betrayal exposed so cruelly, seemed to hang about her like a shroud. Miss Marple, however, was not so easily swayed by gossip. She spent her morning in quiet observation, moving from shop to shop under the pretense of errands. What she noticed was not the chatter itself, but the reactions. Mrs. Finch avoided eye contact altogether, darting into back rooms. Young Martha Linton, the maid who had found Lionel's body, blushed furiously whenever Mrs. Finch's name was mentioned. And Henry Tolland, the solicitor, appeared curiously agitated, as though fearing his own name might enter the scandal next. By afternoon, the tension was thick enough to taste. Inspector Denning arrived at the village hall with the air of a man preparing for battle. He gathered a handful of villagers, Clara, Mrs. Finch, Mr. Tolland, and 2 others, for questioning. But Miss Marple did not attend. Instead, she sat by her parlor window, knitting needles clicking softly, her eyes fixed on the rain-smeared lane. For she knew that scandal had a way of drawing out truths no interrogation could. Secrets slipped more readily in whispers than in police rooms. Sure enough, as dusk fell, she saw what she had been waiting for, a figure stealing across the lane, cloak pulled tight, headed not towards the safety of home but towards the churchyard. Miss Marple rose, set aside her knitting, and reached for her umbrella. "Now," she murmured to herself, "we may begin to learn what this confession was truly about." Sparkles in this chapter. The letters spark village-wide scandal, Clara suffers publicly, and Miss Marple observes suspicious behaviors, ending with her spotting a mysterious figure slipping away into the night. Chapter 15. The Churchyard Meeting. The rain had eased by the time Miss Marple stepped out, though the cobbles still shone slick beneath her feet. She walked slowly, umbrella in hand, careful not to let her footsteps echo too loudly. The figure ahead, cloaked, hunched against the cold, moved with furtive speed towards St. Mildred's churchyard. It was a lonely place at night, the ancient yews leaning like sentinels over mossy gravestones. A single lantern flickered near the lich-gate, casting a wavering glow. The figure paused there, glanced about, then disappeared between the tombstones. Miss Marple followed at a discreet distance, her heart beating a little faster than usual. She had lived long enough not to be easily frightened, but there was something in the air, a heaviness, a sense of secrets too long buried. At last, the cloaked figure stopped before a tall monument, half hidden by ivy. Another shape was already waiting there, taller, broader-shouldered. The 2 exchanged hurried words, their voices low, but the silence of the graveyard carried sound more clearly than they realized. Miss Marple strained her ears. It will all come out now. The letters. They prove nothing. He promised me. And if Clara talks, if she dares, a sharp intake of breath, then a hissed reply, she won't. She's too proud. But you must hold your tongue, or we'll both hang for it. There was a rustle of movement, the glint of something metallic in the lantern's glow. Miss Marple's fingers tightened on her umbrella. For one tense moment she thought the taller figure meant violence. But instead, the object was thrust into the other's hand. Take it. Hide it well. It's the only proof left. The cloaked figure clutched it to their breast and nodded. Then, with a furtive glance, they separated, one vanishing toward the rectory lane, the other slipping past the north gate of the churchyard. Miss Marple waited until both were gone before stepping forward. The lantern still swayed gently on its hook, throwing restless shadows over the gravestones. She leaned upon her umbrella, her mind racing. So there was more than gossip at stake. A dangerous secret had passed hands tonight, and perhaps the very weapon of Lionel Bexley's undoing. She did not yet know which of the two figures was more dangerous, but she knew this. One was desperate to conceal the truth, and the other was frightened enough to carry it away. Miss Marple turned back toward her cottage, lips pursed in thought. "Oh dear," she murmured softly. "It seems confessions are rarely made by candlelight alone. Sometimes they are written in shadows." Sparkles in this chapter. Miss Marple witnesses a secret night meeting in the churchyard, overhearing a tense exchange about letters, Clara, and a dangerous piece of evidence handed over in secret. Chapter 16. Faces behind the shadows. Morning brought a pale, reluctant sun to Elmsworth. The storm had passed, but the village felt unsettled, like a room after a quarrel where no one quite dares speak aloud. Miss Marple sat at her breakfast table, pouring tea with her usual precision, her mind dwelling not on the buttered toast before her but on the whispered exchange she had overheard in the churchyard. Two figures. One cloaked and anxious, the other tall, forceful, pressing something into the other's hand. She replayed the scene in her mind, sorting through the details with the same care she used in unraveling a tangled skein of wool. Who in Elmsworth fit such shapes? The taller one, authoritative, perhaps accustomed to command. The smaller, hesitant, easily led, but now burdened with some dangerous proof. She rose, pinned on her hat, and made her way toward the high street. At the grocer's, she lingered over apples she had no need of. There she saw Henry Tolland, the solicitor, speaking brusquely with the shopkeeper. His frame was tall, his gestures sharp. He looked harried, impatient. Yes, she thought, he might have been one of the shadows beneath the yews. As for the other, Miss Marple found her answer soon enough. Martha Linton, the maid who had discovered Lionel's body, darted into the post office, clutching a parcel to her chest as though it contained treasure or contraband. Her eyes flitted nervously, and she started when Mrs. Alder greeted her. Miss Marple's lips pressed into a thin line. Martha was frightened, yes, but not of village gossip. Of something far heavier. By afternoon, the village was abuzz once more. Word of the love letters had spread beyond Elmsworth to the next parish, carried on the wings of rumor. Clara Bexley remained secluded in her home, refusing callers. Mrs. Finch went about her duties with the dogged air of a woman both condemned and defiant, and Henry Tolland paced outside the rectory, as though rehearsing arguments for an unseen judge. When Inspector Denning called on Miss Marple, she received him in her parlor, her knitting basket on her lap. He was blunt. "We have enough to bring in Mrs. Finch," he declared. "The letters, the payments, the opportunity. It fits." Miss Marple shook her head gently. "It fits too neatly, Inspector. Murder rarely does. You must consider the hands that pass secrets in the dark. Sometimes they belong not to the obvious culprit but to those who gain most from silence." Denning frowned, unpersuaded, but Miss Marple only smiled faintly and returned to her knitting. Her needles clicked softly in the quiet room. She had seen enough in her lifetime to know that when one confession is whispered, another waits just beyond it, heavier and far more dangerous. Sparkles in this chapter. Miss Marple begins matching the churchyard figures to Henry Tolland, the solicitor, and Martha Linton, the maid. Meanwhile, Inspector Denning pushes to arrest Mrs. Finch, but Miss Marple warns him against a too neat conclusion. Chapter 17. The Hidden Object. That evening, Elmsworth seemed to hold its breath. The rain-washed lanes lay quiet, the lamps along the high street glowing in their amber haze. Yet within cottages and parlors, the air was thick with speculation. Rumor had grown so tangled that even the gossips no longer knew which tale was true. Miss Marple, however, had no patience for idle talk. She had set her sights on the parcel Martha Linton carried so nervously. A young maid with trembling hands could not long conceal a dangerous secret. She chose her moment carefully. At dusk, when Martha left the rectory kitchen to fetch milk from the dairy, Miss Marple intercepted her by the garden gate. "My dear," she said gently, "you look pale. Secrets weigh heavily, especially on the young. You'll find them far easier to bear when shared with someone who understands." Martha's eyes filled with tears. For a moment she hesitated, then thrust the parcel into Miss Marple's hands as though it burned her fingers. "I can't, ma'am. I daren't keep it any longer. He said I must, but... Oh, I wish I'd never seen it." When Miss Marple carried the bundle home and unwrapped the brown paper, her suspicions were confirmed. Inside lay a small silver box, tarnished but finely wrought, its lid engraved with the initials LB. Within, cushioned in velvet, gleamed a lady's brooch set with a cluster of sapphires. Beautiful and deadly, for on the underside of the clasp was a smear of dried blood. Miss Marple's breath caught. This was no trinket, it was the weapon. The sharp pin bore traces of poison, its tip still darkened where it had pierced Lionel Bexley's skin. The brooch explained everything. How Lionel had died without a struggle, how the cause had seemed natural. A poisoned pin, delivered in the intimacy of a friendly clasp upon his lapel. Murder by stealth, by cunning, by someone he trusted enough to let close. Miss Marple sat very still, the brooch glinting in her lamplight. Then she replaced it carefully in its box and folded her hands. The question now was not how Lionel Bexley had been killed, but who had fastened the fatal ornament to his coat. And in that quiet moment, Miss Marple knew the circle of suspects had narrowed. For only a very few had both the intimacy and the audacity to clasp such a dangerous token to Lionel's breast. Outside, the church bell tolled the hour. Inside, Miss Marple whispered to herself, "The Candlelight Confession was not his alone. There are others, and one of them still walks free." Sparkles in this chapter, Miss Marple obtains the parcel from Martha and uncovers the true murder weapon, a sapphire brooch, poisoned by its clasp. Now she knows Lionel's death was a crime of intimacy and betrayal. Chapter 18. A Trap in Plain Sight. The next morning dawned bright and deceptively cheerful, the kind of English day when the roses in cottage gardens glowed against whitewashed walls and children splashed through puddles as though there had never been rain. Yet beneath the sunshine, Elmsworth was uneasy. The scandal of Lionel Bexley's letters had shaken every household, and whispers of poison now stirred uneasily beneath polite greetings. Miss Marple, however, went about her day as calmly as ever. She visited the grocer, took tea with Mrs. Alder, and paused to admire the dahlias at the vicarage gate. To any observer she seemed her usual amiable self, but her mind was fixed on the sapphire brooch lying hidden in her sewing basket. She knew now how Lionel had died. What she needed was to know who had wielded the weapon, and for that she would have to watch and wait, and perhaps play a little trick. That afternoon she asked Inspector Denning to join her for tea. He arrived reluctantly, clearly irritated. "I hope you have more than gossip for me, Miss Marple. My superiors expect an arrest." Miss Marple poured his cup with steady hands. "Patience, Inspector. A murderer who kills with a poisoned pin is not a creature of impulse. Such a mind must be drawn into revealing itself." And with that, she set her plan in motion. The following day, she extended invitations for a small gathering at her cottage. Nothing more than a friendly tea, she told them. Mrs. Finch came, stiff-backed and defensive. Clara Bexley arrived pale and trembling, her pride barely holding her together. Henry Tolland appeared, nervous but trying to mask it with bluster. Even young Martha Linton was persuaded to attend, though she looked as though she would faint with every knock at the door. They sat in Miss Marple's parlor, cups clinking, polite phrases exchanged. The air was thick with unspoken suspicion. And then, when the moment was right, Miss Marple brought out her sewing basket. "I came across something curious," she said mildly, opening the lid. She withdrew not the brooch itself, but a harmless trinket, a plain silver pin. She held it up with a smile. It was found among Mr. Bexley's things. Do any of you know it? It was a lie, of course. The real brooch remained hidden, but the effect was immediate. Mrs. Finch barely glanced at it. Clara gave a faint gasp, covering her mouth with her handkerchief. But Henry Tolland, his face drained of color, and for a moment his eyes darted toward Martha, quick as a spark. Miss Marple's knitting needles clicked once, twice, before she set them down. She had seen all she needed. The guilty do not fear the truth so much as its shadow. And Henry Tolland, she thought quietly, had just betrayed himself. Sparkles in this chapter. Miss Marple hosts a parlor tea trap, showing a fake brooch pin to gauge reactions. Henry Tolland falters, glancing at Martha, a silent betrayal that Miss Marple instantly notices. Chapter 19. The Maid's Burden. That evening, the little gathering at Miss Marple's cottage broke apart with awkward goodbyes. Mrs. Finch stalked off, muttering about meddling old women. Clara returned home supported by a neighbor, her face gray with humiliation. Henry Tolland excused himself stiffly, but Miss Marple noted the stiffness of a man holding in panic rather than pride. Only Martha lingered. The maid hovered at the doorway, eyes wide, hands wringing the hem of her apron. At last she whispered, "Miss Marple, may I speak with you?" "Of course, my dear. Sit down," Miss Marple said kindly, guiding her back into the parlor. The girl sat trembling, her voice barely audible. "It wasn't me," Martha burst out. "I never meant to keep it. Mr. Tolland made me. He said if I didn't hide it, he'd tell everyone I was in love with Mr. Bexley." Her cheeks burned scarlet. "But it wasn't true. I only found him that night. I swear it." Miss Marple laid a gentle hand on the girl's arm. "I believe you. Mr. Tolland has rather a way of making people do as he wishes, hasn't he?" Martha nodded miserably. "He said the brooch would ruin him if it were found. He told me to hide it in the rectory pantry, but I was so afraid. I carried it about until I thought I'd die from the weight of it." Tears spilled down her cheeks. "What if they hang me for this, Miss Marple?" "No one shall hang you, child," Miss Marple said firmly. "The truth will protect you, if spoken at the right moment." When Martha left, lighter for having confessed, Miss Marple sat alone in the quiet parlor, her needles clicking in steady rhythm. Her thoughts circled like threads being drawn into a pattern. Henry Tolland. Clever. Ambitious. Ruthless. Lionel Bexley's solicitor. Privy to his secrets. Perhaps he had even drafted the will, perhaps stood to gain by rewriting it. And now, desperate to cover his tracks, he had bullied a frightened maid into silence. But there was one question Miss Marple could not yet answer. Why had Clara Bexley gasped at the sight of the pin? She leaned back in her chair, lips pursed. "Ah," she murmured to herself. "There is more to Clara's silence than sorrow. There is pride. And perhaps knowledge." Outside, the clock struck 10. Inside, Miss Marple felt the pattern tightening. The confession was close, not in candlelight, but in the web of human weakness that bound the village together. And she, with her quiet patience, would be ready to tug the final thread. Sparkles in this chapter. Martha breaks down privately to Miss Marple, revealing Henry Tolland forced her to hide the poisoned brooch and threatened her reputation. Miss Marple realizes Tolland's guilt, but also notices Clara's strange reaction, suggesting she too knows more than she admits. Chapter 20. Clara's silence. The Bexley house stood shuttered against the evening light, its once proud windows dull with neglect. Villagers whispered that Clara Bexley had become a recluse, refusing callers, speaking only to her maid. But Miss Marple, who understood the armor of pride better than most, knew the woman's silence was not grief alone. It was concealment. She called upon Clara the next afternoon, carrying a basket of scones as though her visit were no more than neighborly kindness. The parlor was dim, the air heavy with stale flowers and closed curtains. Clara sat by the hearth, her figure rigid, hands folded tightly in her lap. "You are very good to call, Miss Marple," she said faintly, her eyes shadowed. "Not at all, my dear. A body must eat, even when the heart is heavy," Miss Marple replied, setting down the basket. She took the chair opposite, her knitting bag at her feet. For a time she spoke gently of roses, of the vicar's new sermon, of the weather. Then, with the softest shift of tone, she said, "You recognized it, didn't you? The little pin I showed yesterday." Clara flinched, color rising sharply to her pale cheeks. I don't know what you mean." Miss Marple leaned forward, her voice kind but steady. "My dear, denial is a heavier burden than truth. That brooch was yours, was it not?" There was a long silence. At last, Clara's composure cracked. She pressed a trembling hand to her mouth, tears spilling between her fingers. "Yes," she whispered. "It was mine. A gift from Lionel, long ago, when we were first engaged. He wore it often. Said it reminded him of better days." Her voice faltered. "When I saw it in your hands, I thought the shame of it would kill me. For if the world knew I still allowed him to wear it, even after all his betrayals—" She broke off, shoulders shaking. Miss Marple laid her knitting aside and reached across the space between them, taking Clara's cold hand in hers. "The world need not know everything, my dear. But it is important that we distinguish between what is shame and what is crime." Clara raised her tear-filled eyes. "Do you mean? You think I—" "No," Miss Marple said firmly. "I think you loved him still, despite his faults. But someone else used that brooch for a far darker purpose. Someone who counted on your silence to shield them." Clara drew a shuddering breath. For the first time in days, her gaze steadied. "Then you must find them, Miss Marple. For if Lionel is to rest, the truth must come out, even if it ruins us all." Miss Marple squeezed her hand gently. "It may not ruin you, my dear. Truth, when faced with courage, has a way of setting things right." And as she walked back through the village lanes, Miss Marple knew the final act was drawing near. The murderer had played upon pride, fear, and silence. But soon, with careful threads drawn together, she would reveal the hand that had clasped the fatal brooch. Sparkles in this chapter. Clara confesses the brooch was hers, a gift from Lionel, but denies involvement in the murder. Miss Marple confirms Clara's innocence, and recognizes that the true killer relied on Clara's silence to hide behind.